from the Unstuck Group. This is Amy Anderson. Amy, why don't you share a little bit about your backstory as well?
Sure. I worked with a church up here in Minnesota for the last 12, 13 years. I sat on their executive team and was responsible for our weekend services. So I worked with a great team there, and we're now a 6-site, multi-site church in Minnesota, of all places.
So you love all those instances when you get to go with the Unstuck Group to help churches in Florida, right?
I am open to any church in the Southern Hemisphere. I will be there on a dime.
That's great. Well, the reason why we're connecting today is we've been in this conversation with several of the folks from our team around some of the core issues that we've identified as we've been working with churches over the last couple of years. In fact, we went back and looked at, in our strategic planning processes, all of the core issues that churches identified, and we came up with the top 5. One of them being this area of leadership development and structure, which is an area that you've been most focused on with churches as you're working with them. And so with that, I have some questions around this that I think you're going to be able to help us with, Amy. The first is this. When you're working with churches in this area of staffing and structure, what are some of the common symptoms that you identify that may reflect why the church may be stuck in this area?
Sure. A couple of the top 2 that come to mind right away when you call it a symptom is I see a team at a church where the senior pastor really is looking at just 1 or maybe 2 people for most of the leadership of the church. There's just a couple people they lean on, and so that person has a workload that's ginormous and unable really to be accomplished. And then there's other people on the team who don't have that same level of trust that aren't being developed, number one, because the best leaders probably not having enough time to develop them and given opportunities, and second, the work's just not getting done. The second one is that I observe teams, and we experience this at our church too, is there's a staffing and structure issue when you no longer know how to make decisions anymore. Where a lot of people are looking around wondering who makes the call. The senior pastor is probably actually frustrated because he just wants things to get done and wants the staff to do it, but the staff, they have no idea, is this my call, is this your call? And there's just a lot of murkiness in the decision-making process.
So with that in mind, what are some of the common leadership structure issues that you see, and what's preventing churches from taking this step to correct it?
Sure. Well, structure and staffing issues involve people, and so there are always hard changes to make. Even when you see it, there's a lot of reasons why you don't move in on it. And so, one of the top excuses is it's complicated, and it is complicated. It takes a while to undo what you've been doing for so many years, and when you're stuck, you often have people around the table who have maybe been there a long time. They've been there a long time, but also, what was I going to say on that one? They may have outgrown, the role may have outgrown them. That's what I wanted to say. So they're still leading and they're doing something, but maybe their staff got to a certain size or their ministry got to a certain size, and all of a sudden they don't have those same abilities to lead it as efficiently as they can. So the idea of moving into that leads to the second one, which is just it's a lack of time and energy to face into what needs to get done. Because I think we all know that leading through change is an art. It's maybe a science too, but there's an art to leading people and managing it well. And with churches, you take a couple of missteps and there's this fear that everything's going to fall apart. And so there's always Sunday coming, so there's always this excuse of we just don't have time to face into this right now.
All right, so where I want to go next is to look at some of the structure challenges between 2 different types of churches. We're going to look at single location churches and then multi-site churches. But Amy, let's first focus on single site location churches. What are some of the structure challenges that those churches are facing?
One of the most common structure problems with a single site is there's just not enough diversity on the leadership team. So for the voices being heard, they tend to think a lot alike, they tend to look a lot alike, they seem to be in that same age demographic, and so there isn't a lot of new ideas coming forward. And so that's one of the biggest ones. Second one, maybe on the heels of that, and it links to the last question you asked, is just that the leadership team is often just getting too big, meaning that they've added people over the years, and all of a sudden you've got a lot of people around the table, and again, it's hard to make decisions, it's hard to move, it's hard to even have effective meetings because there's just too many people around the table. Churches tend to add, but we don't tend to subtract when it comes to that leadership team level because there's not enough time or energy to lead through that. So.
It is a challenge on that topic of getting too many people too, Amy. I was probably about this time last year, I was writing on how many people to involve in meetings, particularly leadership team meetings, and we talked about the rule of 8. And really, when you get beyond 8 people in a room, it's very difficult for everyone to participate in the conversation, for everybody to give their input, to ask questions. And certainly gets much harder than to get consensus around direction. So with that, I'm firmly in agreement with you. Sometimes the team's getting too big by inviting too many staff or too many lay leaders to the conversation. Mm-hmm. So those are the challenges for single-site churches. How about multi-site churches? It would seem their structure challenges may look a little bit different.
Yeah, I think every multi-site church would say we have constant structure issues because you enter the matrix when you get into multi-site, meaning you have to lead functionally, but you also have to lead, at the campus level as well. And so probably the biggest structure issue up front is just the mindset of status quo. You move into 2 sites or 3 sites and you think we can just keep doing what we've been doing. But as you know and I know, you get to a point where that thinking holds back growth and it holds back your ability to expand. And so everyone on the leadership team has to move from this mono-site thinking to multi-site. And like, here's an example. In our 6 sites up here in Minnesota, we all just know our senior pastor, it's easy for him to drift into thinking about just the site that he is teaching about. But we had to constantly remind him that there are more people out there than there are in the room that you're in. And so as we make decisions about things, we can't do any cowboy moves that are just going to affect your site. We have to think systematically about how it works around the horn. And I've heard some people say you need a multi-site champion, and I agree with that. You need someone who's constantly thinking about it. But if you have one multi-site champion on your leadership team and everybody else are kind of functional, siloed, territorial people, you won't go either. Everyone needs to become a multi-site champion in staffing and structure.
That's great. All right, so let's shift focus a little bit from structure more specifically to leadership development. And with churches in particular, anytime we start talking about leadership development, there's this question that pops up: leadership development, discipleship. Are they the same thing or are they different? So what's your take on that?
What do you think? No. Well, here's what I know about leadership development. That's another senior leadership concept that has to be embraced, making time and priority to develop your leaders. And of course, leadership development and discipleship go hand in hand because great leaders have great character and great godly wisdom in all that they do. So great teams will carve out time to lead their staff, and they'll figure out how to do that, and then their staff is going to have to find time to develop their lay leaders, and it has to have this trickle-down effect because if you get unstuck and you start to grow, you need more leaders. And so that's a challenge in and of itself. But when you jump to multi-site, it goes on hyperdrive. Every campus wipes out your bench. And so there's a lot of different ways to do it. I'm not an expert on how to drive leadership development other than to continually remind leadership teams that it must be part of your plan with your staff. And then your staff have to embrace it and develop their lay leaders.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit beforehand about, what's that one next step related to leadership development that churches can take, and I would say it's this. From my perspective, Amy, I'd love to get your perspective on this too, is that you can't look at leadership development as a program or an event. Leadership development, because it is, for me, it's discipling leaders. Because it's that's the nature of what we're talking about. It has to be relational, and so it needs to be a part of our leadership teams. It needs to be a part of our ministry teams. It needs to be a part of our small group ministry. However you're structured, discipleship becomes the framework for you how you help people take their next steps. with leaders, we're helping them not only take their next steps toward Christ, but also taking their next steps of influence and leading others. And so that's the first big shift I think we need to make, is looking at it more as a relational connection rather than an event or a program. What are your thoughts on that, Amy?
Oh, I agree. Just like I said, you don't just want one multi-site champion on your leadership team. You can have one who really thinks about it a lot, but everybody has a champion. It's the same thing with leadership development and raising up disciples. You can have a couple people on your team who are great experts at how to do that and create the systems, but everybody on the leadership team needs to embrace it and model it.
So here's the deal. Your team may be wrestling with this very same issue of feeling like in this area of leadership development and structure and how that particularly plays out with your staff team, you're just feeling stuck. And the good news is that's why we're here. The Unstuck Group is all about helping you and your team get unstuck. If you have questions about this particular issue, Amy and several of the other consultants on our team are really prepared to help you take your next steps. And so you can just go to theunstuckgroup.com, click the start button. We'll help start the conversation with you to figure out how we can help your church take its next steps as well. Amy, thanks again for joining us today.
It's great to be with you all.